What if the shot you're taking every week for your weight, for your diabetes, for your health was also quietly protecting your brain from addiction? I'm talking alcohol, opiates, cocaine, nicotine, cannabis, all of it. A brand new study just dropped in the British Medical Journal, one of the most respected peer reviewed medical journals in the world. And it looked at over 600,000 people. And what they found, I need you to understand what they found because this is not a footnote. This isn't a, hey, interesting side effect. This is potentially a seismic shift in how we think about what GLP-1 receptor agonists are actually doing inside the human body. So grab your water, get comfortable, because today on the Weekly Shot, we are going a little bit deeper. Welcome back to the Weekly Shot. I'm your host. And if you're new here, this is where we break down the latest GLP-1 news and research in plain English. No medical degree required, just real talk about what these drugs are doing, what the science is saying, and what it means for people like us who are actually living this journey. Today, we're covering a study titled, and I'm going to read the full title because all of it matters, Glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonist in a risk of substance use disorders among U.S. veterans with type 2 diabetes cohort study, published in the BMJ, accepted January 26, 2026. Now let's get into it. Now, I want to be clear about something before we dive into the numbers. There have been studies before this one suggesting that GLP-1s might help with substance abuse. A study here about alcohol, a study there about cannabis, some randomized trial data, small mixed results, but nobody had done what this team did, which is sit down and ask, what about all of the substances at the same time in the same population, and not just whether people develop new addictions, but what happens to people who already have one? That's what made this different. Two separate questions answered simultaneously in one of the largest data sets ever used for this kind of research. Question one, can GLP-1s prevent someone from developing a substance use disorder in the first place? Question two, in people who already have a substance use disorder, can a GLP-1 reduce what happens next? The ER visits, the hospitalizations, the overdoses, the deaths. And let me tell you, the answer to both questions were yes, consistently, across the board. The researchers used the electronic health records from the U.S. Departments of Veteran Affairs, the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States, 170 medical centers, and over 1,100 outpatient clinics. A complete picture of each patient's medications, diagnosis, lab results, hospitalizations, and more. They started with a base population of 606,434 veterans with type 2 diabetes. These are real patients, real records, real outcomes tracked over time. Now, here's where the methodology gets smart. They didn't just compare GLP-1 users to people on no medications. They compared GLP-1 users to people on SGLT2 inhibitors, drugs like Jardiance. And here is why that matters. SGLT2 inhibitors are used for the exact same indication, type 2 diabetes. They have similar cardiovascular and metabolic benefits. So when you compare these two groups, you're largely comparing apples to apples in terms of the reason someone got prescribed a drug. The key difference, SGLT2 inhibitors work in the kidney. They have no known effect on the brain's reward systems. So any difference you see in addiction outcomes between the two groups is much more likely to be something the GLP-1 is specifically doing. They ran 8 parallel trials, 7 looking at whether GLP-1s prevent specific new substance use disorders, and 1 looking at whether they reduce bad outcomes in people who already have one. The GLP-1 drugs in the study included names you already know. Semaglutide made up the majority at nearly 57%, liraglutide at 22%, daraglutide at 17%, plus exenatide and even a small number of tirzepatide users. So yes, Wegovy and Ozempic are well represented here. The follow-up was up to 3 years, nearly 1.6 million person years of total data. This is not a small study. This is not a signal that can be easily explained away. Let me walk you through what they found for people who had no prior history of substance abuse disorders. These are folks who started a GLP-1 or a SGLT2 inhibitor for their diabetes. And the question was, over the next 3 years, who's more likely to develop an addiction? Here is what the numbers showed. Compared to the SGLT2 group, GLP-1 users had an 18% lower risk for alcohol use disorder, a 20% lower risk for cocaine use disorder, a 20% lower risk for nicotine use disorder, a 25% lower risk, the strongest signal in the entire study, for opiate use disorder, a 14% lower risk for cannabis use disorder. For other substance use disorders, that category included hallucinogens, sedatives, and stimulants, a 13% lower risk. And the composite outcome, meaning any substance use disorder at all, 14% lower risk overall, translating to 6.6 fewer cases per 1,000 people over 3 years. Now, I know some of you are hearing 14% and 18% and thinking, okay, is that actually meaningful? Let me put it this way. Across a population this large, these percentages represent tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of lives where a substance use disorder didn't develop. And these reductions held up. And this is important across every subgroup they looked at: men, women, Black veterans and white veterans, people with BMI under 30 and people with BMI over 35, people with well controlled diabetes and people with poor control. Every single subgroup pointed in the same direction. And it didn't matter which GLP-1 you were on: semaglutide, liraglutide, dulaglutide. All three showed it. This is not a one drug story. This appears to be a class effect, something about the way GLP-1 receptor agonists work in the body that is driving this across the board. One more thing on the adherence data, because this is important. When they looked specifically at people who stayed on their medication consistently, the risk reduction was even stronger, about a 24% lower risk on a relative basis. And that benefit grew steadily over time. The longer you stayed on the drug, the bigger the absolute benefit became. That kind of dose-time relationship is exactly what you expect if this were a real biological effect, not a coincidence. Now, I want to talk about protocol 2, because I think this might actually be the more powerful finding. This part of the study looked at 81,617 veterans who already had a substance use disorder when they started their diabetes medication. The question wasn't about prevention anymore. The question was, once someone is already struggling with addiction, does being on a GLP-1 change what happens to them clinically? And the answer was yes. Compared to the SGLT2 group, people with pre-existing substance abuse disorders who started a GLP-1 had a 31% lower risk of substance use disorder related emergency department visits, a 26% lower risk of substance use disorder related hospitalizations, a 50% lower risk of substance use disorder related mortality. Let me say that again. People with active substance use disorders who were on a GLP-1 were half as likely to die from their addiction related illness compared to people on a different diabetes drug. This is not a small finding. They also saw a 39% lower risk of drug overdose and a 25% lower risk of suicidal ideation or suicide attempt. That last one I need to address directly, because some of you may remember that back in 2023, there were reports out of Iceland of possible self-harm and suicidal thoughts associated with GLP-1 use. That triggered a European Medicines Agency review, and the EMA found no causal link. This study adds to a growing body of evidence suggesting the opposite may actually be true, that GLP-1s may reduce suicidal ideation, particularly in high-risk populations. People with active substance use disorders are already at elevated risk of suicide. And in that group, the drug was associated with meaningful protective effect. And in that group, the drug was associated with a meaningful protective effect. That's significant. When they broke down the pre-existing substance use disorder group by substance type, the results were staggering in their consistency. People with pre-existing alcohol use disorder had a 28% lower risk of composite bad outcomes. People with pre-existing cocaine use disorder had a 22% lower risk. People with a pre-existing opiate use disorder had a 30% lower risk. And the adherence analysis here was even more striking. People who stayed consistently on a GLP-1 showed roughly a 45% lower risk of the composite outcome on a relative basis, with the absolute benefit growing steadily year over year. Okay, so now the obvious question: why? Why would a drug designed to manage blood sugar and body weight have any effect on opioid addiction or cocaine use or alcohol craving? The answer is in the brain. And once you understand this, it actually makes a lot of sense. GLP-1 receptors are not only in your gut and pancreas. They are expressed in the mesolimbic dopamine system, which is the brain's core reward circuitry. The same system that lights up when you eat something delicious. The same system that gets hijacked by addictive substances. Same system. When you take a GLP-1 receptor agonist, it crosses the blood-brain barrier quickly within minutes, and it appears to dampen the dopamine response to rewarding stimuli. It turns down the volume on craving signals. Now, here's where it clicks for a lot of people in our community. You've heard members of the GLP-1 space talk about the food noise, going quiet. That constant background chatter about what you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, and what do you want to eat. It just stops or it gets much quieter. What this research is suggesting is that the same mechanism that silences food noise may be silencing other craving noise too. The pull toward a drink, the pull toward a cigarette, the compulsive loop that drives addictive behavior. The drug may be modulating those reward pathways broadly, not just the food related ones. The authors also point to other potential mechanisms. The drug may modulate serotonin and glutamate systems. It may reduce neuroinflammation and it may strengthen what's called the GABAergic tone, which is essentially the brain's natural brake system on impulsive and compulsive behavior. What's particularly compelling about this study's data is that the benefit appeared early. The two groups started separating quickly after initiation and remained consistent and stable throughout follow-up. That's the fingerprint of a direct biological mechanism, not some indirect confounding factor being cleaned up over time. Now, I always want to be straight with you on this channel, so let's talk about what the study does not prove. This is an observational study. That means they watched what happened to real patients making real choices. They didn't randomly assign anyone to a drug, and that always leaves the door open to what researchers call residual confounding, the idea that people who get prescribed a GLP-1 might differ from people who get prescribed an SGLT2 in some unmeasured way that's driving the results. The researchers did an enormous amount of work to minimize this, such as propensity score weighting, multiple sensitivity analysis, negative outcome controls, different statistical approaches. All of them pointed to the same direction. But residual confounding can never fully be ruled out in observational data. The VA population is also predominantly older, male, and white. The findings likely generalize broadly, but we need more data in women, younger adults, and more diverse populations. And the authors are very clear about this. This does not mean you should ask your doctor to prescribe a GLP-1 to treat addiction. That's not what the evidence supports yet. What it does support is that if you already have guideline supported reasons to be on a GLP-1, like type 2 diabetes, obesity, sleep apnea, and you also have a substance use disorder, or at a high risk for one, choosing a GLP-1 over another medication class may carry meaningful added benefits. That's a conversation worth having with your doctor. What this study is really doing is pointing researchers towards the next step. Well-designed, randomized, controlled trials specifically powered to test GLP-1s as a treatment for addictions. Those trials need to happen, and the data makes a compelling case for why they should. And sure enough, Eli Lilly has a series of clinical trials in motion called Renew, where they are looking at a GLP-1 called brenipeptide, a dual GLP-1 GIP receptor agonist to help with smoking cessation, opioid use disorder, and alcohol use disorder. Additionally, they are looking at it to treat major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Here's what I want to leave you with. When I started this journey in January 2024, I hoped Zepbound was going to help with my weight. I hoped it was going to help my metabolic health. What I didn't fully appreciate, what I don't think most of us fully appreciated when we started, is how deep this drug's reach into the body actually goes. We've watched the research expand from blood sugar to weight, to cardiovascular disease, to kidney protection, to sleep apnea, to liver disease. And now we're seeing credible, large-scale evidence that these drugs may be doing something remarkable in the brain's reward system, something that could have profound implications for the addiction crisis in this country, which kills tens of thousands of people every year. 606,000 people, nearly 1.6 million person years of data, consistent results across every substance type, every demographic subgroup, both prevention and treatment, published in one of the most respected medical journals in the world. That's not noise. That's a signal. So, if you're on this journey, keep going. You're not just changing your weight, you may be doing more for your brain than you ever knew. I'm going to link the BMJ study in the description below so you can read it yourself. As always, nothing in this channel is medical advice. Talk to your doctor, do your research, make informed decisions. If this video helped you understand something new today, please hit that like button. It helps more people find this content. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below. I want to know, did this surprise you? Did you notice anything different about cravings since starting your GLP-1 journey? Let's talk about it down in the comments. I'll see you on the next one. Take care of yourselves.